Sang-mi, you want to?
Is it good? Is it me?
Yeah, there's some weird background noise going on, Sang-mi. So good evening, folks. So those who are assembling, we're going to wait for folks to assemble a bit more. And then at the top of the hour, I'll read off the housekeeping remarks and we can begin. Okay, folks, we're at the top of the hour, so I can see that we have some more attendees that have gathered, but I'm going to start and read the housekeeping remarks, and then we can kick off the meeting. So good evening, and thank you for participating in our remote meeting for our Public Regional Air Quality Management Plan workshop. This meeting is being recorded and webcast. We have two formats for participation, the Zoom application as well as teleconference. Please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone, so that there aren't any disruptions during the meeting. During the meeting, all participants on Zoom, except for our workshop members and AQMD staff, will be placed on mute by the host. This means you will not be able to mute or unmute your lines manually. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. If you're using Zoom on your smartphone, please tap the raise hand button on the bottom of the screen. For those calling in using the phone line only, you can dial *9 on your keypad to signal that you would like to comment. Your name will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note that you can hang up or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Regarding decorum, please treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. And with that, I'll kick us off. So first thing I want to do is introduce everybody. So first I'll introduce myself. My name is Sarah Reese. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Planning at South Coast. And one of my responsibilities is to oversee the development of air quality management plans, which are effectively our blueprint as to how we're going to meet federal and state air quality standards. I'm going to pass it around and ask others to introduce themselves. So first, Mike Kraus, why don't you go ahead?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Kraus. I'm Assistant Deputy Executive Officer working under Sarah. Some of my team members have been helping construct some of the control measures we find in this new plan. Okay, and I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Sang-mi Lee. Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sang-Mi Lee, Planning and Rules Manager. I oversee AQMP and air quality modeling and emissions inventory.
And let's kick it off to Mike Morris.
Good evening, everybody. Mike Morris, Planning and Rules Manager. Barbara?
Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Radline. I'm the Program Supervisor of the CEQA team, overseeing the preparation of the CEQA document, and I'll be walking you through the CEQA scoping portion of the presentation.
Catherine.
Good evening. I'm Catherine Roberts. I'm an attorney in the General Counsel's Office.
And Brian.
Hi, my name is Brian Vlc, and I'm an economist, air quality specialist in the Socioeconomic group within planning, and I'll be presenting tonight on the scope of the Socioeconomic report.
Great. So that's the team that's going to be talking to you today. I just want us to have a few opening remarks. So we are going to start with an overview of where we are on the draft 2022 Air Quality Management Plan. That's the plan focused on how we're going to meet the 2015 ozone standard that has a deadline in 2037 for us to meet. And so we'll go over that a bit. As mentioned, Barbara is going to then cover what we're doing in terms of our obligations under the California Environmental Quality Act. And then Brian's going to give an overview of where we are regarding our socioeconomic analysis. Just a couple of remarks I want to make as we go into this. This plan is a really, really challenging plan. The last plan we did in 2016, that was a plan that was also very difficult, covering multiple federal ozone standards as well as PM standards. But the 2015 ozone standard is very, very stringent. And we're going to have to reduce our smog forming emissions or NOx emissions by 72% over our current levels with plans in place by 2037. That's a very, very aggressive target. Our NOx emissions mostly come from mobile sources. So they account for over 80% of the NOx emissions in the basin. And most of those emissions are subject to federal regulatory authority, not local authority like South Coast or even state authority in many cases. So this is a plan that's going to require a transition to zero emission technology wherever we can, and a pivot away from traditional end of tailpipe controls. But it's also a plan that requires great engagement by the federal government to be able to take action and reduce emissions from their sources. The federal government is currently underway. EPA is looking at a rule on heavy duty trucks, which will help. Currently, heavy duty trucks are the top source of NOx in the basin, but it's not going to be enough. Even EPA's own modeling of the most aggressive version of their truck rule would still have us unable to meet federal air quality standards, even in 2045, which is pretty far away. So a lot of challenges, a lot of challenges, I guess. This rule is plan is also going to be fairly expensive because a lot of technologies we're looking at are advanced and are going to take a lot of doing to implement. But we think we have outlined a plan that will get us there. And so we're excited to be able to share that tonight and be able to hear from you what your questions and your comments will be. We'll start off with Dr. Sang-Mi Lee's presentation. We're going to have a break in between each presentation to take some quick questions that might come up, and then we will have time at the end after all of the presentations for public comment. So keep that in mind as you listen to our plans and keep your questions there. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sang-Mi, to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah, for wonderful introduction and overview of the plan. So as Sarah mentioned, this is a presentation to describe this 2022 Draft Air Quality Management Plan. Next slide. We are hosting multiple meetings with pretty much the same content to provide more opportunity for public and stakeholders to participate and then reflect and provide your opinions that can shape this AQMP. As shown in this table, this meeting is the second of the series. We have one last one tomorrow, 6 p.m. While tomorrow's meeting can have little extra slides specified for Coachella Valley, all the public members from entire South Coast jurisdiction are encouraged to participate at the meeting as well. Next slide. So we'd like to introduce who we are, who South Coast AQMD is. We are local air pollution control agency. We are the largest among the 35 local agencies in the California and the US. We have this much of spaces, areas that we oversee, and then 17 million residents. The key responsibilities we have are we regulate emissions primarily from stationary sources, and then we develop and implement plans such as AQMP to meet air quality standards. We do permit, and then we also inspect businesses, and then we administer lots of incentive funding as well. Next slide. So air pollution definitely has impact on human health, and then air pollution is definitely contribute to the leading cause of death, as shown in this table. They are such as heart diseases, respiratory infections, lung diseases. Certainly, air pollution is the largest cause of unavoidable premature death. Next slide. So that this leads to the question, what is ozone? And then as Sarah mentioned, that this plan targets meeting the ozone standard set by federal government. So what is ozone? Ozone is air pollutant, especially when it is located or placed in so-called human breathing level or the ground level. So ozone is the pollutant that is chemically formed in the atmosphere in the presence of the VOC and NOx emission, and also it requires the sunlight to promote the chemical reactions. Next slide. So there are health impacts that associate with ozone pollution. It is mostly related with respiratory diseases such as coughing, and then irritation in throat, inflammation and damages in airways, or the asthma attack, etc. But also what we'd like to notice is ozone precursors also increase PM pollution, and then PM is a cause of premature death in addition to other serious health impacts. Next slide. So we kind of briefly touch base to what ozone is, what health impact is, and then one more thing to add is ozone does transport as well. As we've seen, when there are NOx emissions and VOC emissions, and then when there is a sunlight, ozone forms. But then once ozone formed, it can transport from one area to another, such as ozone formed in South Coast Basin can transport to Coachella Valley. Ozone can also travel vertically, so it can, depending on how far ozone can go up in the atmosphere, it determines how bad the air pollution could be. Next slide. So there are these two photos that provide real visually what our challenges are. So the ones in the upper right is the Los Angeles picture taken in 1950 versus the pictures on the lower left is the taken in 2017. Needless to say, the pollutions in 1950 were quite awful. Nowadays, as evident from these photos, we made significant progress. However, still, South Coast Air Basin has the worst ozone air quality in the nation, and we are still among the worst PM levels in the entire nation as well. Next slide. So then with this much of air pollution, what do we do? So there is something called National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So EPA has the jurisdiction to establish this air quality standard to protect the public health and welfare. These standards are frequently reviewed approximately every 5 years. And the latest standard was set in 2015, and that was 8-hour ozone standard at 70 ppb. So when the standard is set, EPA also designates the areas that do not meet this standard. Then those areas that did not meet the standard need to develop a plan how to meet the standard by a specific due date in the future. And so this plan we are talking about, AQMP, is the part of the effort to attain that air quality standard by future attainment date. But in addition to that, if the standard is not met by the due date, there are consequences that includes federal sanctions and then federal regulations. So that kind of summarizes what air quality, what national air quality standard is, and then what the steps needs to taken to show the attainment. Next slide. So here comes air quality management plan. As explained in previous slides, when air quality standard is set, the non-attained area need to develop a plan. So AQMP serves as a blueprint for how this region will meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So this AQMP is also required under California Health and Safety Code. And as Sarah introduced at the beginning, this specific AQMP is to address the strategy to attain or to meet 2015 8-hour standard by 2037. The one more thing to mention is this: what we are doing now, the so-called 2022 AQMP, is not the first one, rather it is the latest of the series. And this little icon pictures on the right kind of showing the examples of major AQMPs developed in past 15 years. Next slide. So in terms of AQMP process, this process requires collaboration and partnership with many other agencies. Here it depicts our sister agency of SCAG, EPA, and CARB. And also we also collaborate with many other state and local agencies as well. In addition to that, throughout this process, we value public opinions and public inputs. So we promote this process to the stakeholders as much as possible, and then seek for feedback from stakeholders. Next one. So now a little more delving into actual ozone trend in the South Coast Air Basin. This is how the outdoor ozone level changed over past several decades. So starting from 1992 to current days. There are two areas shown in this graph. Blue is the South Coast Air Basin and red is Coachella Valley. Both areas showed significant progress as we've seen in the previous slides in the photos from 1950 and nowadays. However, it is also noticeable that in recent years, there is a slight uptick in the trend, and the in-house analysis and an expert opinion indicate that poor meteorology contributed to this slight reverse trend in recent years. But still note that emission reductions continues and then expected to continue in future years. Next slide. So now we coming to the stage that how to develop the plan and which pollutants to regulate. So to that question, NOx is identified as the key air pollutants to reduce to meet the ozone standard. There are lots of analysis, but then all of them indicating that there is no path to meet the ozone standard through VOC reductions. Only significant NOx reduction identified as the only viable path to meet the ozone standard. Some of the VOC reductions can definitely contribute, especially VOC is considered as harmful and toxic. And then also VOC contribute to PM as well. Therefore, VOC reductions contribute to improve the exposure to air toxics as well as improving PM levels. The graphs on the right showing the air pollution, the emissions of NOx and the VOC. The upper panel showing in the orange blocks are the NOx emissions, and the lower yellow ones are VOC emissions. It also shows the levels in so-called current days, or we call it the base year. Base year in this plan is 2018, and then future attainment due, which is 2037. So NOx emissions in 2037 is much lower than the current levels. This is due to the ongoing implementation of already adopted regulations and the programs. When it comes to VOC emissions, which is the lower panel here, the future emission is slightly lower, but it is not as noticeable as NOx emission. That is due to the growth in populations and use in many consumer-related products and other sources as well. Next slide. So then question is, where these NOx emissions coming from? We established the NOx as the pollutant to reduce to meet the ozone standard. So NOx emission in the South Coast Basin is primarily coming from mobile sources. So the pie chart in the left represents 2018 composition, and then pie chart on the right is 2037. The pie chart on the right is smaller than 2018, representing the total amount of emissions in 2037 is smaller than 2018. One more thing to notice in this graph is the changes in composition. So most noticeably, this yellow block in 2037 occupies larger fraction than 2018. So this yellow block is off-road mobile sources. So this indicating the sort of changing demographics that emission is more shifting toward off-road mobile sources. And this also indicates that it is critical to focus on emission reductions in off-road mobile sources, since that is the category that grows in the future under business as usual assumption. Next slide. So then how much emission reduction is needed? Once we already seen that the emissions in the future year is expected to be lower than current days due to already adopted regulations. However, that is a so-called business as usual situation is not enough to meet the 70 ppb ozone levels, ozone standard. So here on this, at the end of this yellow arrow, this text saying carrying capacity is approximately 63 tons per day. So carrying capacity means that that is the maximum amount of NOx emission that can exist in the atmosphere while still meeting the ozone standard. So we have to reduce emissions all the way to 63 ton as indicated with this bright yellow arrow. That is starting from 2018 level, that is 82% reduction from current day level. And it is also 71% reduction from 2037 business as usual level. So indicate significant amount of NOx reduction needed to meet the air quality standard, the 70 ppb ozone standard. Next slide. So we take 1 second here to compare this, the emission reduction goals to meet the 70 ppb ozone standard with the previous standard. There are multiple 8-hour ozone standard, and each of them has its own milestone years or attainment due dates. And the other two attainment due dates are 2023, 2031. And in this graph, the yellow block represents a so-called business as usual condition that represent currently adopted regulations. The orange blocks are the reduction goals to meet the specific targets. And these reduction goals getting increasing as progress toward further future years as the air quality standard becomes more stringent. For 2037 is bigger than ever. Next slide. Then the question is it feasible? Is it possible to meet this 70 ppb standard in next 15 years? The bottom line is our analysis indicates it is possible, but then it's since we already made significant progress in ozone air quality. However, it will be challenging, it will be difficult. It cannot be achieved alone by ourselves. We need a partnership with other agencies. And then it will be also expensive. And then in addition to that, even newer technology and the newer emerging, more advanced technology are necessary to meet this standard. Next slide. So to get to that destination point, we need some innovative approaches. This South Coast Air Basin is already heavily regulated and mostly driven by traditional approach, which were the regulations on tailpipes, exhaust on the stacks, or even the new technologies or even improvement in fuel efficiency, those all tailored on specific cases. While those may be traditional approaches, these new challenges require innovation that can bypass this traditional approach wherever it is feasible, because the emission reduction goal, so-called 71% reduction, cannot be achieved easily. Next slide. So some considerations to achieve this zero emission. One, so how does the pathway would be? And then next one, what type of fuels to consider? It is traditional fuel might not be enough, so we need a completely new scheme and completely new fuel mechanisms. And also, how can we make it affordable, especially for economically distressed communities? So these are all the considerations that the plan is trying to address. Also, this will be the considerations even after adoption of the plan, and then during the implementation stage, still this will be considered and then further refined with time. Next slide. So now let's delve into the strategy. What are the actual control strategy to meet the standard? So we start with the stationary and area source control. And in stationary and area source control, we identified or we categorized 4 measures. One, NOx control measures, and second, co-benefits, seeking for co-benefits from greenhouse gas reductions. And then we also considered in limited strategic VOC measures and other measures. Next slide. So starting from NOx control measures for stationary and area sources, we further grouped them into 3. They are residential combustion, commercial combustion, and large combustions. And then each of the measures are listed here in the fine font, but details are available in the documents released for public review, and the documents are available on our website. And later on this slides, we present that the website web addresses. And among these 3, the first 2 are considered residential and commercial building measures. Next. So building measure is not easy. Nothing is easy in this plan. However, this the residential and commercial buildings also impose lots of challenges. But one thing we can say is we are not the only one looking for emission reductions from these areas. There are many state and local entities seeking for same policies and similar regulations, including California Energy Commission, which is Title 24 regulations. CARB's draft SIP strategy looking for emission reductions in this area as well. Bay Area AQMD is currently making rules for zero emission appliances. And other cities such as the city of Berkeley, and then there are over 50 cities in the entire state looking for the opportunities to reduce emissions in this sector. Next. So this explains our approaches. We put in these 4 steps. First one is coordinating with other entities as shown in the previous slides. And second, we're looking for the zero emission options for water heating, space heating, cooking, and other fuel combustion in residential and commercial sectors. And third one, where it is feasible where it is needed, we're looking for off-ramp options to accommodate near zero and low NOx technologies. And lastly, we will be utilizing incentives to promote the more rapid or accelerated turnover to zero emission appliance/equipment, especially for economically distressed environmental justice areas. Next slide. So this kind of summarizes our NOx strategy for stationary area sources. We have a regulatory approach that will require NOx emissions through the rule amendment and development. And then we also have incentive approaches that will focus on disadvantaged communities and encourages earlier deployment of the technology. Next slide. So now moving to Now moving to strategic VOC controls. So as we mentioned, while NOx is the key pollutants, and the NOx reduction is critical to attain ozone standard, we also have limited strategic VOC control, as discussed earlier, because VOC is also considered as toxic, and then reducing VOC can improve ozone in nowadays, as well as the PM levels. Next one. So moving to South Coast AQMD's mobile source strategy, which has these 4 groups of measures: one facility-based measure, and second emission growth measures, and we also have incentive measures, and there are other measures as well. Next slide. So still, this slide lays out the key considerations for a zero emission approach. For the mobile source zero emission approaches, we use indirect source rules. This is a part of facility-based mobile source measure. So currently we have indirect source rules under development for seaports and rail yards. And then indirect source rules for warehouses are already adopted and in implementation stage. We also have a voluntary approach with the commercial airports. And these are part of consideration for facility-based measures that provide unique opportunities to seek further emission reductions from operation of this type of facilities. Some of the measures, we're still working with US EPA to acquire SIP creditable emission reductions. Next slide. So the next group is emission growth management. This includes new and redevelopment projects, and this also include provisions for general conformity, the project that's subject to general conformity, which is, in bottom line is, that requires federal action do not have any additional emissions in non-attainment or maintenance area. So we include the provisions to accommodate or to work with the federal entities with the project that's subject to general conformity. This plan also includes clean construction policy, and this will be in coordination with the CEQA projects. Next one. There are multiple incentive programs as depicted in this slide, such as Replace Your Ride and the Small Off-Road Equipment Exchange Program, so-called the Lawn and Garden Exchange Program, and then incentives for passenger locomotives, car mower programs, and then Pacific Rim Initiative for maritime emission reductions, and then mobile source emission reduction credits. So the focus is we continue taking credits from these programs, and then where feasible, we try to extend these existing programs and then keep it as successful. Next slide. The AQMP also include the CARBs measures, specifically as laid out in the draft 2022 state SIP strategy. This is very brief overview what type of measures included in the SIP strategy. It has multiple measures for area sources, on-road vehicles, off-road vehicles and equipment. Also, CARBs include measures that seek for emission reductions from the sources subject to federal and international regulatory authorities. And this pie chart here shows where the measures are coming from. It is basically, as mentioned, area sources on-road, off-road, and in a federal jurisdiction area. Next slide. So this slide depicts the emission reductions that expected from the implementation of the state SIP strategy. So blues are the NOx emissions and reds are VOC emission reductions. And this is how the CARBs SIP strategy estimated. This is how the emission reductions that CARBs SIP strategy estimated. And then we reflected this in our attainment demonstration as well. Next slide. So this summarizes where the emission reductions coming from to attain or to meet the 2015 ozone standard. It's categorized in 5 areas: point and area source, on-road mobile, off-road mobile, ocean-going vessels, aircraft. Yellow block is business as usual, the 2037 so-called baseline emissions. Orange block is remaining emissions. And this thick white arrows indicating the amount of reductions expected in each category. And this reduction reflected the strategies laid out by South Coast AQMD and CARB's drop the SIP strategy, and also incentive measures. The last category, aircraft, it doesn't really show much of emission reductions. However, we cannot afford leaving any category untouched from this emission reduction requirement. So this leads to the next slide, actually. Next. So this is something called federal and international sources. Aircraft is definitely one of them that was regulated by our federal government and international agencies. In fact, in South Coast, approximately 1/3 of the total emissions are regulated by international federal and international agencies. Those categories are mostly ships, aircraft, locomotives, and some of selected off-road equipment, and then heavy-duty trucks. But as we mentioned, given the significant amount of emission reduction goals, no categories can be remained untouched. Therefore, even though these sources belong to federal authority, we do need emission reductions from these categories. Next slide. This visually depicts how much emissions can be allocated to federal sources versus CARB and AQMD, meaning that defined sources. So this entire stack of emissions are the total emissions expected in 2037. The last one, orange block, is a so-called carrying capacity. That is the amount of emission we can accommodate while meeting the standard. And this black box, literally this black box is the emission amount that's subject to federal authority. And this yellow block is, the yellow block represents reductions that South Coast AQMD and CARB has authority to regulate from. Next slide. There are other issues such as the transport to Coachella Valley, and then also reductions, how fast and how much reductions the neighboring areas can do while South Coast is going through these rigorous emission reductions. If South Coast go down to the 80% cleaner than current day level, and our neighbors would not do any reductions, then South Coast will turn to net importer of air pollution from our neighboring air basin, indicating the importance of collaboratory effort that reducing emission not only South Coast but in neighboring the air basins as well. The cost effectiveness and affordability is definitely an issue, and then it's continuous conversation, and then that's the area also we're looking for the public input as well. Next slide. So again, this public input and then feedback is a key component in developing AQMP. There has been multiple venues that soliciting this AQMP development and public inputs as shown in this graph. Next one. Currently, draft AQMP is out on public domain and then open for public comments, and the website address is as given here, and then this is a snapshot of the website. Next slide. There are multiple ways to provide your opinion to us. The internet has the submission form as shown here. You can use email or phone calls. So we appreciate your comments received by June 21st to reflect your comments to next version of AQMP. Next slide. So our next step is we'll make a draft AQMP based on your feedback, and then we will host another set of meetings called regional public hearings during summer. And then we'll consider this, we'll bring this to our board, and then I'll host a public hearing in October and subsequently submit to CARB and EPA. Next slide. We encourage you to stay informed by signing in our e-newsletter so you can receive the update in AQMP directly from us. Next one. Smart app as shown here, is a great way to stay connected with us as well, not only in AQMP, but also other announcements such as air quality forecast and alerts for the unexpected air quality event, etc. Next slide. So here is another AQMD resources that public can reach out to us through website or AQMD telephone hotline. So with this, we conclude the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sang-Mi. A lot of information there. So I think at this point, we want to take a little pause, see if there's any questions on the substance of what Sang-Mi presented before we turn to the other presentations and the rest of the content. A reminder, there will be a chance for general public comment at the end after we've run through all the presentations. So this is only if you have a specific question to what Sang-Mi just discussed. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so maybe we will turn to Barbara Radline, who will talk about our CEQA processes and what we're doing with AQMP.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Happy to do so. All right, so good evening, everyone. My name is Barbara Radline. I'm the program supervisor of the CEQA team in charge of preparation of the CEQA document, and this is the CEQA scoping meeting. Next slide, please. So CEQA, for those uninformed or unfamiliar, it stands for the California Environmental Quality Act, and it's a state law which requires evaluation of 18 environmental topic areas, and the 2022 AQMP is a project subject to CEQA. Now, because the AQMP is a series of actions that can be characterized as one large project in the connection with issuance of amending rules or regulations or adopting new rules, we decided to prepare a program environmental impact report. Next slide, please. So the CEQA scoping meeting that we're having is held in conjunction with the public workshops. And we do that because we like to get comments at the time that the notice of preparation initial study is released for public review and comment. The CEQA scoping is required for projects with potentially significant environmental impacts. And it's a perfect opportunity for the public and other agencies and interested parties to find out more about the project and to provide suggestions on the scope of the CEQA analysis, additional topics to evaluate in the draft program EIR or environmental impact report, to provide ideas on mitigation measures as well as on project alternatives. And any comments that you provide tonight, or if later on you want to submit written comments, will be considered when preparing the draft program EIR. Next slide, please. So the CEQA process is multi-stepped, and we're in the golden arrow section of the process, the Notice of Preparation Initial Study, NOPIS for short. And what it does is it notifies the public that we intend to prepare a draft program EIR, and it evaluates the 18 environmental topic areas and calls out the specific areas that will require further evaluation in the program EIR. The NOPIS has been released for a 32-day comment period. We released it on Friday the 13th, and the comment period will end on June 14th. And this is the first opportunity for the public to provide comments. Now, as we prepare the draft program EIR, there'll be a second opportunity to provide comments. And the draft program EIR will be a bigger document. It'll analyze the potentially significant environmental topic areas, as well as recapping the conclusion of the impact areas that were either concluded to have no impact or less than significant impacts. The draft program EIR will actually identify the mitigation measures specific to the significant impact areas, as well as analyze the project alternatives. The difference between the NOPIS and the draft program EIR is that you'll actually get a little bit more time. It'll be 45-day comment period for the second opportunity. As the AQMP development team makes modifications to their proposal, we will also do the same thing and keep in step with that process. And for the final program EIR, we will make those updates and incorporate them. The final program EIR will also include the comments received relative to the draft program EIR, plus the NOPIS comments, plus the CEQA scoping meeting comments. And then as we bring this project to the governing board for their consideration, and hopefully certification, they'll also consider adopting the mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plan if required, and adopt findings and a statement of overriding considerations for the significant impacts, if any. Next slide, please. So the analysis in the NOPIS, it evaluated all the control measures and incentive programs proposed in the draft 2022 AQMP. And the best place that I could direct you to is see Appendix A of the NOPIS, because what it does is it lays out each control measure and then gives a brief summary of the potentially significant environmental impact areas so that you can get some context for what the analysis in the draft program EIR will be focusing on. Chapter 1 will provide a background information and the project description, where Chapter 2 really just gets into the details of the environmental topic areas and the potential impacts that we may encounter. The summary table at the bottom of the slide on the left identifies the potentially significant impact areas. So it's air quality and greenhouse gases, energy, hazards and hazardous materials, hydrology and water quality, noise, solid and hazardous waste. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the NOPIS is out for public comment for a 32-day period. It'll close at 5 p.m. on June 14th. The document, if you haven't seen it yet, it's available online, and we also have hard copies available, although it's not at the in-person meeting because we're virtual today, but feel free to reach out by calling us, and if you would like a hard copy, we can send you one. Next slide, please. For sending comments on the NOPIS, please direct them to Kevin Nee of my staff. He's on vacation, having a good time, so a little jealous of him. But if you send comments, please send it to him via email or fax. Or if you'd like to go old school USPS, send it to the address at the bottom of the screen for headquarters. And just as a reminder, any comments that we receive, we will include them in the NOPIS. We will include them in the draft program EIR and their responses when we release the draft program EIR. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the status of the draft program EIR is we are currently writing it, and we intend to release it for a 45-day public review and comment period in July. And again, it will include the comments from today that received from the CEQA scoping meetings from today and tomorrow, and any written comments that we also receive on the NOPIS. As with the NOPIS, we will also post it on our webpage, and it will be available from our Public Information Center. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so that concludes my presentation. Here are the CEQA team contact information for Mike Kraus and myself and Kevin Nee of my staff, in case after you write a comment or not, or you just have a question and you wanna talk, feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. That concludes my presentation. I think we'll open it up to any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So again, we just, if you have anything, questions on the substance of what Barbara just discussed, now would be the time. I see that Harvey, I believe, has his hand up. Harvey, you want to go ahead?
Hello.
Hi, Harvey.
Hello. Hi there. I'm Harvey, and I'm talking for myself. Good evening. Actually, I was late in trying to make a question on the end of the last one. I wanted to know the I had heard recently from a CARB meeting that was like 20–30% of NOx went to PM. I want to know what I heard it referred to here as well. I want to know what that number is with you folks and how it was calculated. Very important.
Sure, Harvey. So it's true that NOx is actually a really important precursor emission for forming fine particulate matter in our basin. Most of our fine particulate matter actually is formed in the atmosphere versus being directly emitted. But I'll turn it over to Dr. Sang-Mi Lee, who can provide you more details with what the characteristics of that look like for our particular region.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so Harvey, it is correct that PM has multiple chemical compositions. And then there are nitrate, sulfate, ammonia, organic carbon, elemental carbon. There are multiple species that we integrate all of them and call as fine particles. That's a fine particle matter, or PM. But then in our basin, approximately 25%, as you mentioned, is so-called nitrate that is coming from NOx. So as Sarah mentioned, that is why NOx control is important, because it reduces ozone as well as PM levels.
Wait, it reduces ozone as well as PM? I thought you just said 25% of PM 2.5 comes from NOx.
So you can say that too. So yes, but then there is.
So I think what Sangmi was saying is that NOx controls both PM and ozone in our basin, and so we have a big So it's which is. Go ahead.
Well, okay. Well, we were discussing this. The big deaths, 90% is from PM. The small stuff that goes right through your lungs and everywhere. And the Lancet study said, 1 million to 1.5 million September 18 premature deaths in the year, for each year in the U.S. That's the district uses, CARB uses 7,500 deaths for the whole state, and the district's been using 4,000 or 5,000. So what PM is in reference to ozone, there's one thing, and then ozone something else. So what I like to know what the deaths are from ozone. And that's a number that we can work with using the 25, but I got to understand it better. But
sure, Harvey, we're still going through our socioecon analysis that would actually break that out and break out the health impacts that are associated with basically needing to be able to meet the ozone standard. We did that work as part of the 2016 AQMP, and so we have some details in that as well.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Okay, we participated in 2016 and we got trashed. Okay, we got run out of federal court, Ninth Circuit, 2.5 years ago by the FBI and the federal marshals under color of authority and threat of imprisonment. We got no support from UL, CARB, or EPA. That's really outrageous, and nobody evaluated the solar new deal, which had 100 exhibits based on the Sunshot program, which was based on the moonshot, which got us to the moon. And then we've got, Elon out there trying to go to Mars instead of dealing with our problems. And
Harvey, I think you're veering into more public comment territory over.
Okay, we'll save it for that. But we have been cut off 3 times today in different meetings, right when public comment. And that's a pattern. And it's outrageous. And that's how we're being trained. Well, I want to get into this stuff with y'all, but that study came out in 18. But the plan was in 16, and you did not evaluate solar at all. You did this and that here and there, and this is significant stuff. This is the state of the art. This is our government. This is the Department of
Harvey,
Energy.
I think you've veered into public comments. So if you can please reserve that for the end.
Well, in looking what's cost effective, you got to have 2.
Okay. So I think if I'm not seeing any other hands, just a last call if there's any questions on our CEQA presentation. Okay, well, maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to give us an overview of where we're at on the socioecon analysis. Take it away, Brian.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And once again, my name is Brian Vlc. Good evening, everybody. I'll be bringing it home with an overview of the socioeconomic impact assessment that will be presented in addition to the forthcoming AQMP. Next slide, please. The purpose of the socioeconomic scoping is obviously to provide transparency and collect input on the key socioeconomic issues and potential alternatives to the proposed measures. We discussed the draft outline and each planned component of the 2022 AQMP socioeconomic report. Of course, as part of our public process, we engage continuous stakeholder involvement with 2 components. We have the STMPR advisory group, in which 2 previous meetings involved socioeconomic topics, one happening last year in November and again in March. And our third will be upcoming on May 31st next week. We also have 3 scoping sessions and regional public workshops, and there will be more announced and scheduled. Next slide, please. The AQMP Socioeconomic Report is its own report separate from the AQMP, and the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment has been conducted since 1991 in order to better inform the public and policymakers. Although this is not statutorily required as in our rule development process, nonetheless, we provide a detailed analysis to enhance the decision-making. The 2016 report incorporated more than a dozen key recommendations from a 2014 independent review by Apt Associates, and we have made a commitment to provide this as well in the 2022 report. So we will continue to incorporate these recommendations. We have a 60-day review period for the draft report, which is anticipated for a late June release, and then another one for the 30-day process associated with the final report due in September. Next slide, please. So the outline of the overall report is a short non-technical executive summary, and the bullet points that follow in the next item are the chapter headings. So there will be an introduction covering the overview of the entire report. Chapter 2 will be the incremental costs and cost effectiveness. Chapter 3 is the quantified public health benefits and other non-quantified benefits. Chapter 4 is the projected macroeconomic impacts. Chapter 5 is a sub-county distribution of cost, benefits, and job impacts. And Chapter 6 is an environmental justice EJ analysis. And finally, the conclusion and future enhancements anticipated in future rule development and other cost measures. Additionally, we will provide technical appendices that will get into more detail on the cost measures or control measures and the associated costs and analytical methods that went into those. And of course, an extensive response to comments at the very end. Next slide, please. Okay, what will be quantified? Our plan for the control measures will involve costs and public health benefits. So we do intend to provide measures with quantified emission reductions that are ready to be committed into the state implementation plan. While generally we only stick to that which we can quantify, there are some emission reductions that are being assessed for technologies that are not yet deployed or available, and for which we may not be able to gather sufficient cost information to quantify the costs associated with those emission reductions. Nonetheless, to the extent that we can discuss them, we will provide as much detail as possible. Okay, so at the to be announced is infrastructure costs resulting in the transition from to near zero and zero emission technology. This is building on what was discussed in the last AQMP, and to the extent that we know more, we will provide additional detail on that. With regard to regional job and other macroeconomic impacts, we will provide impacts associated with quantified costs and public health benefits for these measures directly affecting residents and economic sectors within the South Coast AQMD region. And then additionally, any secondary regional impacts from measures anticipated that are not within the AQMG jurisdiction, and we will model those to the extent possible. Next slide, please. So the incremental costs of the plan, of course, include cost by control measure for any item that is assuming emission reductions. We will assess the costs affected by industry, including small business, to the extent that the data is available, and we'll be identifying the costs most likely incurred outside of the state or the region. This would be, for example, technologies that are produced outside of the region but are implemented inside of our region. Since a lot of these are a phased approach for implementation, we evaluate the costs on a level that we provide the projected year of spending so that we can get an accurate analysis of the impacts over time. And then finally, we try to evaluate the cost effectiveness by control measures. So that's the cost relative to the emission reductions. And we use two different methodologies. One is discounted cash flow, or DCF, and levelized cash flow, LCF. And I will explain a little further in the next slide. Next slide, please. So we provide the formula here, but just to talk first about DCF. DCF expresses in present dollars the purchase and operating, or O&M costs, relative to the total emission reductions achieved in the useful life of the equipment. Conversely, LCF expresses in an annual figure the amortized capital costs plus the annual O&M costs relative to the annual emission reduction. So it's one is looking at the entire life of expected useful life of the equipment. The other is expressing essentially the same thing in a more annualized figure. So to make this a more tangible analogy, we use a home buying analogy. So DCF incorporates what would be seen as today's market home price, plus the money is set aside today in any fixed interest rate account to account for utilities, maintenance, and upkeep of the house. LCF would analyze this by looking at the annual fixed rate of a mortgage payment, along with, this is assuming no down payment, and the annual cost for utilities, maintenance, and any other expenses for any given future year. And these are essentially two different methods. They often don't align exactly, but they are both considered to be acceptable methodologies for calculating cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. So the public health and other benefits that will be evaluated, we will look at the modeled changes in PM 2.5 and ozone concentrations, and accordingly, we will estimate the changes in health incidents due to changes in the health risk, according to improved air quality. So the two components of that are mortality risk, in other words, the changes in the number of premature deaths, and then the morbidity risk, which are things like changes in hospital admissions, ER visits, and missing work or school days. Additionally, we will monetize the public health benefits and will perform sensitivity tests of the key inputs. And then finally, we will make a more qualitative discussion of visibility, material, and agricultural benefits. So visibility is somewhat self-explanatory. With improving air quality, the visibility is expected to improve. With material, that would be the impact of degradation on property or building materials. And then finally, the benefits of agriculture would be things like increased productivity and improved yield of crops. Next slide, please. Regional job and macroeconomic impacts is done using a specialized modeling software, what we call an input-output model, developed by a company called Regional Economic Models, or REMI. And this gives us some information on the job impacts due to incremental costs that we put into the model. It can also tell us the job impacts due to quantified health benefits, public health benefits, net job impacts, and it's just distribution specific to industry sector and occupation and earnings group, and the competitiveness of industry by sector with the components listed below. Next slide, please. So additionally, the varied policy impacts within the South Coast region, we look at a more detailed sub-county level to look into the components below, such as cost, public health benefits, and other net job impacts. And then with the environmental EJ analysis, we use the SB, or Senate Bill 535 definition for disadvantaged communities, which often has influence on AQMD's grant funding decisions. Within this analysis, the EJ communities, pardon me. So we will also use alternate EJ definitions incorporating environmental and socioeconomic indicators that are considered to be a useful method of sensitivity analysis. This analysis will also show how estimated public health benefits vary for both EJ and non-EJ communities. And in addition, we will use well-known inequality indices to evaluate how the AQMP affects health risk inequality for both EJ and non-EJ communities. Next slide, please. And that is it. Myself in the middle is one of the contacts in the team of the socioeconomic group, along with Dr. Ryan Finseth and Dr. Elaine Shen, who is our manager. And that will be the staff handling this component of the AQMP.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brian, for that presentation. So at this point, if you have any questions on Brian's part of the presentation, please raise your hand. I see that Harvey, you have your hand raised. So question on socioecon, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, Harvey.
Am I being howdy? Evening. I'm Harvey Eder, talking for myself and for PSPC and like-minded folks, etc. Two areas initially in environmental justice, the concept of equity, that diversity, equity, inclusion, the district's using. All right. So it's generally referred to as in terms of emissions, and that these areas have more emissions and are trashed, and they get sick and die, mortality and morbidity. So there's equity, as we did a study for the PUC, coordinating with CEC. The first time this was done for solar and for low income, and the initial financing thing, OII 42 in the late 70s, early 80s, financing the solar transition. And we did this with Commissioner Grimes, the first Black commissioner. And we came up with the concept of to deal with inequity, taxing through the rate base, and extending monopolies into competitive solar areas. Is that the cutout, 10%, went to low income. So we did a study of how money was going to be spent. And we said we were going to coordinate it with other programs and we were going to increase the number. But the idea was to coordinate it and leverage it. All right. So, and the concept of equity was not just to have less air pollution, which is great, and, instead of being dumped on and trashed, but equity in terms of decision-making, control, ownership for communities, workers, et cetera, and the state. And we put in a $63 million proposal to you all a few years ago, and you told me, Sarah, well, the time's not now, we're going to litigate. And you said, don't. The time will come in the future. And this was with BYD. We were talking to Tesla. And 7 years ago, they said they could manufacture 5,000 Class 8 trucks.
Hey, Harvey, is there a question? Yeah. Do you have? Is there a particular question on the socioeconomic?
Trucks could have been down the road now, but you guys purged it. That's typical of how you're not doing solar and pushing, renewable, so-called renewable natural gas in this stuff.
Right. So Harvey, I'm not hearing a question here.
A question is, did you look at that study? The low-income solar equity program presented by the PUC and CEC in 1981, which we submitted to you many times. I want to know. I don't believe anybody has looked at it, and we talked about this. And I'm incorporating by reference the February 8th administrative meeting with me and Dr. Burke and a little bit from Wayne. And he said, this has never been studied. You got a footnote here and this. And he said, this entity, these folks are the public on solar.
Thank you, Harvey. I think we're veering off to public comment again.
Okay, that's one thing, okay?
Thank you, Harvey. All right. Any other questions that folks have on socioecon analysis? Okay. Seeing none, let's turn now to general public comments. If folks have any public comment they want to offer up for the good of the order. I'm seeing a hand up for Mark Abramowitz. Mark, go ahead.
Hi, nice to see you guys again. This is always the highlight of my day. Just a couple of comments. I think it's very good that staff did a great analysis on the impacts of climate change on air quality here. That was something that was requested by former board member Joe Liu. But the concern is that that information and data on that impact is not going to be included and should be included in the modeling analysis. And staff has indicated that, well, by using their current assumptions, they're just following EPA requirements. But I would suggest that you would have great success if you made that request to EPA. The district has made many such requests, and some of them have been of questionable value to improving air quality. My additional concern related to that is that the input to the CEQA analysis is going to result in an incorrect analysis. You'll know that you need additional measures perhaps for timely attainment, and that won't be reflected in a CEQA document. So the impacts of that won't get properly assessed. In terms of additional control measures, the staff should look at NSR as a control strategy and looks toward fixing the current program. In addition, exemptions that are in district rules and regulations should be reevaluated. And the control measures that the district has adopted in the last several years should also be reevaluated in the context of a cost effectiveness guideline improvement that reflects tougher standards to meet. In terms of a CEQA alternative, districts should include in an alternative a more stringent alternative that would incorporate comments that were made for greater stringency, including ones that I've made, but that others have made also, as a more stringent alternative. And that's all I have for right now.
Appreciate that, Mark. That's definitely a lot of food for thought that you give us. Yeah, I will say on looking at climate impacts, EPA has pretty stringent guidelines on what we need to do in terms of attainment demonstration. And right now that's, climate impacts aren't included, but we do know that climate does have an impact on our air quality and air pollution levels, and that with warming temperatures, that's going to make it more difficult for us. So it's something that we keep in mind, but it's pretty clear cut that it's something that we don't consider in our evaluation with EPA. All right, I see that Harvey has his hand up again. Harvey, this is for general public comments, so go ahead.
Howdy, it's Harvey for PSPC, etc. I called you earlier this afternoon and you said bring this up now. I was purged from public comments in the last group, last couple anyway. And that's a pattern. I wrote 9 different things out. Number one, trucks. I was told, that the federal government controlled trucks over small fleets. I thought it was 15 was the top. You told me recently that's not true, that the state has control of this. That's a question. I just want to get all these issues out first, and then maybe they could be addressed. That's important. Okay, so that's very important, and that we could have had heavy duty trucks out here now, but this stuff was stifled 5, 6 years, 7 years ago. Now, in carbon, you're talking about carbon and global warming, and we know the interface with that. And we put on, in responding to the draft of the 16 plan from June, July 16, and August 12th, we went over the numbers and we used the new numbers on methane and the 20-year life instead of 100 and radiative forcings, etc. We got, and the Arctic is warming and melting, and it's putting carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide, which has 300 times and went up 10 times in 10 years. And okay, we got real big problems that was not evaluated by y'all. And we brought this as cover article from National Geographic in September of 19. Brought it to Fabian, brought it to Burke, brought it to Aaron. Nothing's done. All right. The real number is at least double. Carbon equivalent is at least double or triple. Now that's the real. We got to be real with people. If we're going to deal with our problems, we got to be real. We got to use science. All right. So we got to redo those numbers. And what happens in the Arctic? This whole thing. These people that are pushing fossil fuels, their days are numbered. I'm sorry. Maybe all of us are. They're going to take us with them, but they are responsible for that. It was not part of IPCC, and it's the cost that they've got to pay for externalities, the morbidity, everything else. Okay, so that's the real low carbon fuel standard. We're this from the very beginning in 08 and 09. And we brought this up. How there's two down markets. This is $10 billion has been spent in the last few years on this. It's going national. They're doing.
Hey, Harvey, I just want to remind you that we're you can. This is general public comment, but we are talking about this particular plan is focused on criteria air pollution, greenhouse gas and climate, sort of outside of our purview as a local air agency.
Low carbon fuel steroid is part of the program, and $10 billion has been spent in the last few years, and the technology is flaring, which gives you 5%, not 150, 200 point, CO2 equivalent. That's garbage. And Sam Wade, we brought this. We went to Sacramento. We kept on bringing this up, and we got trashed. It was never evaluated. It's illegal. The technology is flaring. Not putting out the short term, all this 20-year basis and radiated forcing, and stuff's imported into the state. 95% is fracked. Study out of Cornell, Howard 10 years ago brought all this stuff up. It's outrageous. This is stifling solar, so electric and fuel cells. All right, this is outrageous. And the guy, Sam Wade, not only did not evaluate this, he went and he's running the so-called natural gas entity.
All right,
That's
Harvey.
Conflict of interest. All right. So, okay, that's important. Now, this guy, the study on the 13th, this guy Cohen from Berkeley, he said at 50 degrees pollution control works. At 80 degrees, it doesn't. What's happening? The temperature's going up. How much stuff doesn't work? How much stuff works? What are the emissions? What's allotted to what? We're doing a study on this, and we want you to fund us. Also, we're doing a plan, the 22-23 plan, the solar plan based on sunshot, and also what's happening in the world. And we're doing it. We're applying for a 7403 planning grant and other things, and we're doing that. It's got to be done. All this stuff's got. We have immediate total solar conversion, but we've done this in the last 30 years. Okay, this technology's been there. It can be used. The market's taken it over. 270 gigawatts of new stuff going in. 80-90% solar and wind, primarily solar. 60% is owned in 2020 by the oil companies. We cannot let this continue. We got 2/3 of our country have no.
I think we've got the point. So appreciate your comments.
No, these are specifics and have to be addressed. Okay, when you talked about your costs,
Harvey, we don't address climate impacts in the SIP.
Okay, for heat health costs, the Lancet plan said 1 million to 2 million people premature deaths a year, not even more morbidity. Okay, and that's at 10-12 million a piece. That's a lot. That's the cost of the whole economy. $15-20 trillion. All right, that's only part of the externalities. This is garbage. And you said it was the 16 plan was supposed to deal with PM.
All right, Harvey. I think we've gotten the gist.
The study of Lancet did not.
Thank you, Harvey. Appreciate that. Do appreciate your comments. Again, want to remind you that this is a plan on criteria air pollutants, and it's not designed to look at climate, although we understand that there are impacts on climate regarding climate and air pollution, and that there's some relation there.
Right. And we will be getting some co-benefits, for the actions that we're taking that will benefit. So.
Any other hands up for public comment? One last call for that. Okay, seeing none, I think at this point we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much for your attention this evening. Appreciate your listening to what we have to say, and looking forward to your continued involvement as we work to finalize the draft 2022 AQMP. Again, there'll be additional draft coming out as well as additional meetings throughout the summer, so there'll be plenty of time for more of your input. Appreciate that. Have a good night, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Sang-Mi. Thanks, BR. Thanks, Brian. Good job.
You bet. Good night.
Everybody, bye.
Right.
Bye.